attribute, for example, is like this, something like this, and place its name inside the rectangle for the associated entity in the ER diagram. And naming and defining attributes. An attribute naming is a noun and should be unique. To make an attribute name unique and for flattery, each attribute name should follow a standard format. And similar attributes of different entity types should use similar but distinguishing names. And an attribute definition states what the attribute is and possibly why it is important. Should make it clear what is included and what is not included. Contain any aliases or alternative names. States the source of values for the attribute. An attribute definition should indicate if a value for the attribute is required or optional. If a value for the attribute may change, and any relationships that attribute has with other attributes. And what's the candidate key? Candidate key is an attribute that uniquely identifies each instance of an entity type. And what's the identifier? Is a candidate key that has been selected as the unique identifying characteristic for an entity type. And selection rules for an identifier. Choose a candidate key that will not change its value. Choose a candidate key that will never be null. Avoid using intelligent keys. And consider substitution single value surrogate keys for a large composite key. And multivalued attribute. What's the multivalued attribute? An attribute that may take on more than one value for each entity instance. What's the repeating group? A set or two or more multivalued attributes that are logically related. And required attribute. Required attribute is an attribute that must have a value for every entity instance. What's the optional attribute? Optional attribute is an attribute that may not have a value for every entity instance. What's the composite attribute? Composite attribute, an attribute that has meaningful component parts. And what's the derived attribute? Derived attribute is an attribute whose value can be computed from the list attributes values. And we can look about relationships. What's relationship? Relationship is an association between the instance of one or more entity types that is of interest to the organization. What's the degree? Degree is the number of the entity types that participate in a relationship. And we can look about the conceptual data modeling and the ER module, binary relationship, a relationship between the instance of one entity type, also called the recursive relationship. And binary relationship is a relationship between instances of the entity types. This is the most common type of relationship encountered in the data modeling. And ternary relationship. Ternary relationship is a simultaneous relationship among instances of three entity types. And cardinality, the number cardinalities in relationships, the number of instances of entity B that can be associated with each instance of entity A. Coordinately, the minimum numbers of instances of entity B that may be associated with each instance of entity A. And maximum coordinately, the maximum number of instances of entity B that may be associated with each instance of entity A. Mandatory and optional coordinately specifics whether an instance must exist or can be absent in the relationship. And naming and defining relationships. A relationship name is a verb. Peer and avoid verb names. A relationship definitions explains what action is to be taken and possibly why it's important. Gives examples to clarify the action. A relationship definition should explain any optional partition, explain the reason for any explicit maximum coordinately other than many, explain any restrictions and partition in the relationship, explain the extent of history that is kept in the relationship, and explain the extent of history that is kept in the relationship, and explain whether an entity instance involved in a relationship instance can transfer partition to another relationship instance. An associative entity, an entity type that associates to the instance of one or more entity types and contains attributes that peculiar to the relationship between those entity instances, sometimes called a gerund. And the data modular chooses to module the relationship as an entity type. And summary of conceptual data modeling with ER diagrams. The purpose of ER diagramming is to capture the richest possible understanding of the meaning of the data necessary for an information system or organization. And representing supertypes and subtypes. Subtypes is a subgrouping of the entities in an entity type.